Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Gender is, of course, one of the most contentious ethical and political topics you can find at the moment. There are numerous practical and policy debates, for example those relating to medicine, prisons and sport, which can seem completely intractable and which provoke the strongest possible opinions on all sides. Sitting behind these practical questions, however, is a cluster of theoretical questions, which can be summarised as questions about what gender actually is. Graham Bex-Priestley, a lecturer at the Idea Centre, has a novel approach to these questions. He suggests that we should think of someone's gender as being something like their name. In this interview, he explains why. Graham, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jim.
So we're here to talk about gender as name, and this is based on a paper that you've written with that title, right? So I wondered if, first of all, you could tell me kind of what's that project all about. So what's the problem that you're trying to solve with that idea?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I suppose the first thing to mention is that it's not meant to be the most important project or the most important problem that is faced today. So by coincidence, this podcast has been recorded on Trans Day of Remembrance, which is a day to remember all those who have lost their lives as a result of being transgender. Because every one of which is a tragedy. They're mostly trans women of colour, disproportionately sex workers, and mostly in Latin America. But of course, issues facing trans people are in our country too. This year, there was 11% rise in hate crimes against trans people, which is remarkable in a year where racist and homophobic hate crimes fell for the first time on record. The Home Office said that one of the explanations they gave for the rise was that it might have been because of politicians and media comments on trans people. So the point I guess I'm making is that today's episode is going to be quite abstract and theoretical.
Yeah.
It's not directly related to the main issues about trans rights, access to healthcare, loads of issues that are a mess that need sorting out.
Yeah.
And this is quite, it's about metaphysics and semantics and about how we should categorize genders. And that might help in an indirect way. So for some people might be sympathetic towards trans people, say, but don't understand how it makes sense. And this is an attempt by me to make some sense out of the phenomenon of self-identification.
Okay.
So in the paper, I start with an example of somebody who has a certain biology that it's typical of most women. So this person, I call them Sam, has ovaries and has high estrogen, but every other quality of Sam is not typical of women. It's more typical of men. So Sam has short head hair, long leg hair, is attracted to women, and loves fire. So what did I say? Fire, science, prog rock, philosophy, and violence. Right? Just someone who falls into the stereotypes of men more than women. And so the question Sam asks himself is, what am I? What gender am I?
Yeah.
And there are many different answers people could give, and it's going to come out differently on different gender theories. But one of Sam's friends might say to Sam, well, the fact that you like all these things and you behave in certain ways and you look a certain way, that's evidence that you're a man. And a different friend says, that's silly stereotyping. We should just say, actually, no, it's your biology that makes you a woman. And then the third friend says, don't listen to these other two people. We shouldn't divide society biologically. That sounds a bit weird. We shouldn't divide society by stereotypes. That sounds like it might be playing into the wrong sorts of tropes and ideas. It's up to you how you identify. So you have the control of what your gender is. And I'm sort of interested in, how does that make sense? It doesn't seem like anything else that we have.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. So, and your answer to this is to put forward a concept of gender according to which gender is or it is like name in some kind of way.
Yeah.
But before we get into the kind of details of that, I was wondering if you could say something about what's the sort of status of this claim that you're making, because I think what you say is that you're involved in an ameliorative project here. So could you say a bit about what that means?
Yeah, it seems to be what many, if not most, people working in gender take themselves to be engaged in. So the idea is that there are different ways of doing analysis of things like concepts, and one is a kind of descriptive way of doing things where you look at the way that we use words and have concepts, and we try and figure them out and expel them out in more detail and make them clearer to everybody else. But a different thing that we might do is say, I don't care how people actually use words or actually have concepts. What we care about is having the best concepts, right, and making concepts do the work that we want them to do in the world. So, for example, you get some people who argue that gender has to be biological because that's the way that lots of people use the word in a biological sense. Uh-huh. But that's not the way everyone uses the word anyway. There's different uses of words like man and woman, especially true across cultures. Several countries even like legally recognize more than two genders, like India, Nepal, Germany, I think. So clearly people have different usages in mind. And so the ameliorative project says, well, rather than sort of trying to figure out what is the concept as if there was an actual concept in use that we all share, we're just going to try and forge concepts which capture some sort of political goal that we have in mind. And the goal that I have in mind for this particular project is something that makes true self-identification or first-person authority.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So the idea is not that the way people use the word, use kind of gender language at the moment is analogous to name in some way necessarily. You're saying, in a sense, it would be better if we did use it in that kind of way, and that would help us in various ways. Is that right? Yeah.
I mean, and in the paper, it's not even that strong, right? In the paper, it's a conditional claim, which is, if the goal is self-ID, then here's a theory that will do that work. Because I thought it was interesting when I was going through literature that this idea of self-identification, which I think there's a sort of caricature of gender theorists and academia in general as being kind of already accepting self-ID as true. But I found the opposite. I found that most gender theories didn't capture that at all, didn't even try to. So that's, I guess, where my theory came in, is just trying to see if there was a way to make it come out true. And so your question was, is this... So I was saying that it's a conditional claim in the paper, but my personal view is, yes, it would be good to have this concept, at least in day-to-day interactions, to have this way of thinking about gender. There could be other situations when we don't care that much about respecting someone's first-person authority over their own gender. We might, say, be looking into discrimination in the workplace, and you might think what's important there isn't what someone identifies as on the inside, but how they're treated by their employer, and that's going to depend on how their employer thinks of them more than how they think of themselves. So it might be a different sort of issue to think about that.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. And I I suppose we should probably, acknowledge this is just an extremely fraught kind of area of discourse, right? So, to an extent within academia, but certainly in society at large. I suppose some people. So you've said that you kind of want to put forward an idea that's going to kind of deliver the result that self-identification is kind of valid, right? Essentially, that people are the gender that they say they are, or kind of feel that they are, or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
So I suppose some people might want to reject that, as you've already kind of alluded to. I mean, others might say, yeah, that's okay, kind of in general, but that there might be some exceptions to, like, how we might draw out the consequences of self-ID. So we wouldn't want to just say that in all circumstances, self-ID is the last word on kind of, for example, what category somebody should be competing in sports, or what kind of prison they should be put in if they've committed an offence or something like that. So, I mean, is your argument compatible with that kind of view, or is it just saying that no, self-ID is all there is to say on the subject?
Yeah, exactly. So the first word you said was this is a very fraught subject, and that's putting it mildly. Well, professor was stabbed in Canada teaching philosophy of gender course this year, and 2 students. It's clearly got very important consequences for lots of people, and that's important to say.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the issue of things like sports or prisons or other things, do I think that self-ID is always the case? No. I think that, or do I think it's always the most important matter? No. And that goes for any theory of gender. So even if somebody convinces me that the correct theory of gender is biological, or some other theory of gender, that won't answer these questions.
Yeah.
So, for example, it changed. Prisons in England and Wales changed this year to be based on what genitals you currently have as a sort of blanket rule. But before this year, and in Scotland, it was more on a case-by-case basis. It's about a risk profile. Where are you best going to be placed to minimize harm to yourself and others?
Yeah.
And there are cases when even cis women, so when I say cisgender, it just means not trans. Don't read too much into it now.
Yeah.
So even cis women have been placed in men's prisons before who were a danger to other women. The issue of where to put people shouldn't just be done based on gender or what your gender recognition certificate says. It hasn't been in the past, and I don't think it should be in the future either.
Yeah, okay.
Sports is interesting as well, right? Because I never really thought about what good are sports, so that this topic sort of raises really fundamental questions about what are we doing this for in the first place.
Yes.
I used to play a lot of sport, still play a bit of sport now, but as a kid, I was in the England squad for badminton, and so I'm aware of some of the negative sides of sport, right? I think it's probably true that there are very few children who make national squads without some kind of pushy parents at minimum, right, or maybe a pushy coach. So at best you get these sort of that element. At worst you get just outright abuse, people being told to do what they don't want to do, and then of course it gives rise to divisiveness and nationalism and racism sometimes, and violence, and we're aware of the bad side. So there must be something really good about sport if we're going to justify it. So what is it? It's healthy, and you've got to think, okay, so what therefore justifies the divisions?
Right.
And some people would say something to do with biological advantage, and you think, well, maybe that's why we should segregate sports into categories. And then they ban trans women from chess, and you think, it can't be that reason. If that's unless you want to say that women have a biological disadvantage and just have brains that can't do chess, maybe it's about representation. And then you think, well, are trans women overrepresented in sport? No. So it sort of raises those questions, which obviously we can't solve right now.
Right.
But segregation in sports clearly doesn't have to just be on gender either. You've got heavyweights in boxing, you've got weight classes, and I guess it just raises these questions of what is it that justifies the segregation? Yeah. Does that apply in this case? Should we just wait till the science is more settled? So some people say, after a certain amount of time on hormones, it changes your body enough so that it's sort of okay. It's kind of an empirical question, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. But I suppose to bring it back to the kind of metaphysical, I suppose, project that you're involved in here. I suppose the thing to say is, well, this is going to give us a kind of vindication for self-ID in general, but then that's going to become a kind of principle, and there might be other principles at play here, right? So you can't just kind of read across from, the idea that you're vindicating self-ID to give you an answer in all of these really difficult kind of applied categories.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's one, and you can have it so that, this is the case in prisons, for example, where it's still supposed to be at least standard practice that you would still refer to a trans woman in a man's prison as she, for example, and that can still be true and the right thing to do. So it doesn't always have to be the only thing in play. Yeah.
Yes, good. Yeah, okay. So we're in the business of trying to vindicate self-ID, or to put it another way, to use a phrase that you use in the paper, I think, first-person authority, right? So the idea that somebody has some kind of authority over their own identity, their own gender identity. And you distinguish between three different kinds of first-person authority. So you have epistemic authority, ethical authority, and metaphysical authority. So I think we probably should unpack those, especially for people who don't have a philosophical background and so might be daunted by those terms, those kind of jargon terms. So what's the distinction there? Epistemic first-person authority versus ethical first-person authority versus metaphysical first-person authority.
Yeah, thanks. Well, a lot of this comes from Talia Becher's work, and so let's start with metaphysical authority, which is the thing that I'm trying to capture. This is just the idea that you yourself determine what is the case. So in the case of gender, it would be the case that if you did sincerely say or sincerely avow or sincerely, whatever it is, the mechanism, endorse a particular gender as yours, then that would be true. It would sort of make it the case that it was true. Contrasting with that, you've got epistemic authority, where it's not that you make it the case that you are the gender that you say you are. It's that you are best placed to know your gender.
Right.
So it's a separate fact what gender you are. But the best person to know the gender that you are is yourself.
Yeah.
And that might be the case for lots of, say, mental states. You might think, well, the best person to know whether I'm happy right now is me. You can try and guess from the way I'm looking, but I'm in a better position to know my own mental states than you are. And then you've got ethical authority as well, which is a different case again, which is it's morally right to defer to your authority. It's morally right to sort of take you at your word, even if you're not best placed to know your own mind, and even if you don't make it the case that it's true. It could just be a different way in which we respect your authority. So those are three different ways.
Yes, good. Yeah, okay. And the one you're after is metaphysical first-person authority, right? So that's to say it's the kind of authority whereby, as you just put it, if you sincerely avow a certain gender identity, that in some sense makes it the case that gender identity is applicable to you. Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's worth kind of just noting the use of the word sincerely there, right? That seems quite important. So it's not just an avowal which makes it true, but it has to be a sincere avowal in some sense, right?
Yeah. You can't just sort of say I'm a woman, and it has to be sincere in some way.
Yeah. Good. Okay, thank you. So why do you think we need to aim at metaphysical first-person authority? Why is ethical or epistemic first-person authority not enough?
Yeah, I mean, so in reality, I think it probably might be enough. But in the paper, so the reason why I think we should aim at this stronger one. So Talia Becher argues against the epistemic version, and I think that she's right to do so, by saying that we're not always best placed to know our own minds. Sometimes we deceive ourselves. Sometimes we're just not in the right frame of mind to introspect well enough.
Yeah.
And so other people sometimes know us better than we do.
Yes.
And so we sort of might like to cut that off as a way of thinking.
Yeah. So just to kind of illustrate that, because that might seem strange to some people, I suppose, but kind of imagine you say, I'm not angry with you, but then like you're kind of behaving in a way which sort of seems to betray that you are angry with somebody.
Yeah.
They might, in that kind of case, actually be better placed to understand that you really are angry with them than you are. Right? So you might be mistaken about your own kind of mental state in that way.
Yeah. You're just not always aware of your own self. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So why is ethical?
Yeah. So Talia moves to ethical versions of authority because of these reasons. And she says, well, it would be an affront to your autonomy and if you sort of didn't take people's first person avowals as decisive. So an example would be, imagine someone says, I want to go home now. If you sort of start saying, no, you don't, and then you start sort of challenging them that they know their own mind, it's going to undermine people's self-confidence. It's going to have some really bad effects, gaslighting perhaps, and that's bad, right? So I sort of accept that there are certainly cases when we should take people's statements as decisive, even if we don't really believe them underneath. It might have worse effects if we start questioning them all the time. Yeah. But to me, it feels like there are certainly some cases where it's fine. So your example of being angry with someone. So if you say to me that you're not angry with me, but I can sort of tell, it might be perfectly ethical to sort of say, it's all right, Jim, like, I think you are angry with me, and you might sort of try and work it out and say, maybe it's because I did this, and it might be justified that you're angry with me, but you are angry with me. And it's sort of, it doesn't seem necessarily unethical to disagree with you about your mental state sometimes. And so this is why I think maybe we should try for something stronger if we sort of don't want people to be fighting over their own first personal descriptions of their gender. Okay, good. Thank you. We're aiming for metaphysical first-person authority, so we want to come up with a way in which it's a sincere avowal of someone's gender identity kind of makes it true that gender identity is appropriate. So what accounts of gender have philosophers other than yourself come up with, and what are the implications of those accounts for metaphysical first-person authority? So many. So many. So in the paper, I go through just a handful of them. There's so many, it's like saturated with gender theories, and I've added to this. So the ones that I go through are some of the most popular ones or influential ones. And I start with just biological views, where your biology determines your gender. So how that exactly is cashed out is more complicated than it seems. Yeah. What is your biological sex? Is it a thing, or is it just a group of things? Anyway, but we can sort of acknowledge that there's a way of doing things where you sort of look and say, okay, well, you've got ovaries, a womb, XX chromosomes, high estrogen. You've got all these characteristics, and we're going to say that means that you're a woman. And then different for people with different biology. But then that's clearly different to self-ID, and it's sort of intentionally the case. So that's ruled out if we want to look for self-ID. Yep. Then I sort of look at Sally Haslanger's view, which has been really influential, which is to think of gender as a class of people that are marked out for subordination or privilege on the basis of their real or perceived reproductive organs or role in reproduction. So our society is built in such a way that we privilege people that look like you and me because they assume that we have a male's role in reproduction and vice versa for women. And so on this view, again, self-identification doesn't come into the picture. You might identify as a woman, but if you are seen as a man and you are treated with privilege on that basis, then you would come out as a man on Sally Hasangler's view. Or if you're seen as someone who has a female's role in reproduction, and this is her language here, then you, regardless of how you identify as a man, as genderqueer, as agender, doesn't matter. Right? Gender is essentially something that happens to you rather than something you choose for yourself.
Yeah.
So again, no authority of the individual here. And this is kind of true for a lot of gender theories, where really it's looking at social realities rather than a kind of individual subjective experience. So that goes for family resemblance views, according to which roughly, I should say, all of these are much more nuanced, right? We were sort of rushing through these.
This is a quick survey, yeah.
Yeah, so like family resemblance views are just say, well, look at the typical woman, imagine what she looks like, maybe get a few different exemplars because they might look different across, say, different cultures and other demographics, different ages. And on the other hand, get a bunch of men, maybe this is also friendly to other genders too, get a bunch of genderqueer people. And then you can sort of say, well, if you've got a person, let's call this person Fred, you see, okay, which group of people does he resemble the most? And the family resemblance concept means that you don't have to think of specific conditions. So like Fred might have a certain biology, might not, might have certain tastes, might not. It's sort of just put them where they fit the most.
Right.
So again, it's more trans-friendly in that you can have people who, it's not purely biological, but again, if you resemble something you don't actually identify as, then it's going to come up with a different answer.
Yeah, so self-ID wouldn't be vindicated by that either.
Yeah. Oh, and then you have Judith Butler. How much to say about Butler's view? It's tough, right? Judith Butler's got a view of where gender is performative. So this comes from the performative turn in linguistics, where people like Austin and Searle realized that language doesn't just describe facts, but also brings about facts.
Right.
And so the one classic example is something like, if you're the right person in the right situation, saying something like, I now pronounce you wife and wife, or something, right?
Yes.
You have not just described what you were doing, you've brought about a fact in the world. And this sort of performance of language sometimes makes changes in the social world.
Yeah.
And in a similar way, gender, according to Butler, isn't really something that you are and then you later describe yourself as being. It's just something that comes about through action and repetition. So if you perform woman, it's not that you are a woman and there's a woman underneath you, and then you express that as a result of your womanhood coming out into the world. It's more like there's just the performance itself.
Yes.
And there's nothing underneath that expresses that. There's just the performance. So again, it's obviously very interesting and important and good in describing certain ways in which the world works and the way in which we do routinely perform these things, like sort of semi-consciously. It's not really, we don't sit there and decide to speak in a certain way or what's the thing I saw the other day? Someone said, do you take your top off by grabbing from behind and pulling it over your head, or grabbing from the front and pulling it up over your head? Like, that's a gendered way of taking your top off.
Oh, really? Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Well, I mean, apparently men are more likely to take it off that way, and women are more likely to take it across their arms and pull it up from the top, from the front.
For the record, I think I'm an arm crosser.
You're an arm. Well, you are subverting gender norms, Jim, so that's good. But again, this is something that is self-ID doesn't necessarily come to the picture. Yeah,
okay, that's it. Yeah, well, we don't need to kind of get into any of these particular views in too much depth, but that's kind of interesting, that view of gender as performance. Would just to kind of try and make sense of that, would that be something like saying a gender identity is something like kind of in some ways akin to your identity as a kind of member of a certain kind of subculture or something like that? So you could kind of say, like, I'm a goth. And what being a goth means is that you kind of perform gothness in various ways. Like you wear certain kinds of clothes, listen to certain kind of music, go to certain clubs or whatever, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it's not that there's kind of, you know, an inner core of gothness that you're expressing. I mean, goths listening may take issue with that, but that would be the idea. It's just it's an aspect of the way you present yourself and the way you kind of perform socially. And gender would be something like that, maybe a little deeper than that in some ways, but essentially it would be
or less deep,
performative in the same way. Right.
Or less deep. So I think that's a really good example. I think that there's a way in which you might think that, so being a goth, for example, you might think there's more choice to it, in that there is the way that you present yourself. You typically is going to be quite chosen. And so there's that element, and Butler wants to make sure that it's not a performance in the way that drag is, or that playing a role in theatre is,
right? Where
you literally perform, and it's much more subconscious than that. And so in a way, it's less deep in some sense, because it's not like, you know, a goth might think this is genuinely who I am, that I am trying to sort of express.
Right.
Whereas Butler wants to be like, no, gender's not even who you are. There's nothing like that that's going on. It's a myth. It's an illusion.
Yes.
That there is any manhood in us.
Okay.
That's as far as I understand it, and I don't want to misrepresent.
No, absolutely. No, it's interesting stuff though. And so, but is that view not compatible with self-ID then? Because, I mean, you might think, well, if someone's performing in a certain way, that you would think that would be likely to be in line with their conception of themselves in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think it gets us really close. But the reason I reject it in the paper is that it doesn't get us all the way. And there would be cases where some people might self-ID as a certain gender. I mean, I think it is most trans people aren't out in the workplace, for example. And when you can see why. I think that, so there's a massive pay gap for trans people. And you can do the tried and true CV test, send them out to employers, identical CVs, but change some demographics. And so you figure out that, okay, if you're white, you'll get more likely to get an interview than if you weren't. If you're a man, you're more likely to get an interview, especially for male-dominated areas, than if you weren't. And also, if you're cis rather than trans, then you're more likely to get interviews.
Right.
I think one of the main differences, though, between the two is that typically it seems to be an unconscious thing for, say, like racism in employers. Like typically you ask an employer, would you hire a person of color? They'd be like, yeah. Right. Yeah. But when it comes to trans people, you ask them, would you hire a trans person? And a really substantial number, I think it's something like a third, just say that they'd be less likely to hire somebody trans.
Right.
So yeah, you have this is probably one of the reasons why lots of people don't come out at work, because they know that there's not this policies. So then they're at work and they're performing a gender they disavow. And so I guess Butler here would just say, you know, if you are constantly performing a gender that you disavow, you just are that gender. And it might be very sad that society is making you a gender you don't want to be, but you are the gender you don't want to be. So it goes against self-ID in that sense. So
presumably she'd have to say you're that gender in context where you're performing that gender, and you might be another gender, like if you go out at weekends and you're performing a different gender, then you become that gender, right?
Yeah. And Judith Butler's a they, but
apologies.
I make mistakes there. Yeah. So Judith Butler would say things like that, I think. And Robin Denbrough is another person who takes a kind of this sort of view, and they say that In situations when you're prevented from expressing yourself in the way you want, Denbrough says, they say, I don't take that as a view, as a case of you being the gender that you are and then unjustly presenting as a gender you're not. Instead, Robin says, you're just unjustly prevented from being the gender that you are. Yes. Or prevented from being the gender that you want to be, sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's similar to like Asta's view where constraints and enablements are put on you. And so if you're trying to have a different set of constraints and enablements, if you don't get uptake from other people, then it's like, it's just not up to you. It's society that's doing the job.
Okay. Great. Okay. And so your contribution to this debate is to introduce yet another conception of gender. And as we've said, you're wanting to propose this idea that gender might be like name or should be like name in some sense. So in what ways is gender like name then on your account?
Yeah. There are some similarities that you might point to. And for one, we tend to be given them when we're born. We tend to be given names when we're born and raised in particular genders as we're born. Or before we're born. So you're a parent. I don't know how many people sent you cards and stuff that begin with "it's a boy" or something.
There was some of that. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so it seems to be like or people who that's what they want to know. That's the first thing they want to know about a child.
People have gender reveal parties, don't they?
Yeah. As if it's like it's such an important part of our culture that we identify what gender someone is and raise them differently depending on what the gender is. So yeah, there's some similarities. And another similarity is that it's how we're referred to a lot of the time. So we have conventions that mean that just pronouns like he and she. They are ways to refer to people, but they indicate the gender in a way that like a name does, right? You can refer to someone with a name, you can refer to someone with a gendered pronoun. And the other ways that might seem similar are things like, for at least in some cultures and some, I guess, pockets of this country, we like to take people at their word when they tell us what their gender or name is. We don't, if you introduce yourself and say, "Hi, I'm Michael," we tend to sort of say, "Cool, that's Michael." And we don't bother checking to see what their birth certificate says or what their change of name deed says. Like we just sort of accept it. That's what they want to be called. That is their name.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the matter. So yeah, those are some of the examples perhaps.
Yeah, good. Okay. So, and that account essentially vindicates metaphysical self-ID. I mean, the use of this word metaphysical, I think people shouldn't kind of take...
You don't read it too much into it.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like a kind of very abstruse word, but really all it means is it kind of makes it the case. Metaphysical self-ID is the idea that the act of avowing an identity makes it the case that you have that identity, basically. And this vindicates that because, in the same way that if I decided, my name is now Bartleby, that kind of makes it the case that it's Bartleby, right? If I kind of tell everybody I'm going to be Bartleby from now on, then you ought to call me Bartleby. And I really am called Bartleby in some way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in common usage, I suppose we do sometimes have these two understandings where some people might sort of think, well, your real name is your legal name or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, that's not the kind of name that I want to talk. Like, I would say, actually, no, that's just your legal name and that's not your real name. Right. In my opinion, your real name is what you have chosen for yourself.
Yes.
So yeah, that's what I want to sort of say about gender as well.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay. So I suppose one worry that you might have about that kind of approach is that, like, actually, doesn't it sort of cheapen the idea of gender a little bit? I mean, for example, kind of misnaming somebody. So if you kind of went on calling me Jim instead of Bartleby, it doesn't really seem like very much hangs on that. I wouldn't have kind of much room to be offended or much reason to be offended because of that. Whereas actually, like, people who are misgendered take that very seriously, and it does seem like it's, quite a sort of hurtful thing to do to somebody.
Yeah.
So can thinking of gender like name sort of make sense of that kind of difference?
Yeah, I think so. And I suppose the first thing to say here is that it's going to be contingent on the person. Some people don't really care that much if you misgender them. Some people care loads if you misname them.
Right.
Some people get very irritated if you miss out the E from Rachel, or and in the paper I give examples, one fictional, one real. So the fictional example is Neo from The Matrix, and if you haven't watched The Matrix, he has an arch nemesis called Agent Smith, and Agent Smith sometimes calls him Mr. Anderson.
Yeah.
Which is dead naming him in the sense of calling him his legal name rather than his chosen name, which is Neo. And this idea of dead naming, it's taken from the phenomenon we see in for transgender people. People often refer to them as the name that they had rather than the name they've chosen for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it turns out that example in The Matrix may have been intentionally a kind of use of a metaphor for kind of dead naming transgender people, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so that's what they can, at least Lily confirmed that was what The Matrix was an allegory for. And then if you watch the fourth one, they've made it much more explicit. Because of course, the concept of red-pilled, and the red pill community. So you've got the people who are taking the first Matrix, and then the red pill community is obviously very not politically aligned, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so the fourth one's very much like, we're just going to make it on the nose now.
Right.
This is this is our political stance here.
Okay.
So we have this issue of Neo being dead named by Agent Smith, and that's a massive affront to him. And a real example would be Muhammad Ali, who people would call Cassius Clay, which was the name he was given at birth, and he disavowed that name, and it would be a massive insult to him if people called him Cassius Clay. Sometimes it was done intentionally, and sometimes it wasn't. So names can mean a lot to lots of people, and genders can sometimes not mean very much to some people.
Right.
I used to get misgendered a lot when I was working in retail. I didn't have the beard back then, but I still had my long hair, and people, especially kids, would think I was a woman. I didn't mind, but that's my thing is very, very different from, especially if you're trans, for example. It might be very, very important to you that people recognize that. And at the same time, one of the issues that it's going to be different to misnaming is that often it's going to come with risk of violence. So people who are misgendering you and doing so intentionally, they might have bad intent, and so you're going to be on alert for that in a way that you typically are not when it comes to misnaming. So it's kind of like contingent, basically. It's not necessary, but it could happen more so in one direction than the other. Okay,
good. All right. So another worry that you might have about this is, I guess it's kind of related in that it points to a kind of worry about whether name is enough to kind of make sense of people's idea that their gender identity is kind of about something deep about them. And the way of bringing this out, and I think you kind of acknowledge this in the paper, is that, well, if I change my name to Bartleby, right, I'm not thereby saying that I was always really Bartleby, right? And it doesn't make it the case that, I've always been Bartleby and I've just now come out as being Bartleby, right? That's not what's going on there. I was called Jim. I've now changed my name.
Yeah.
Whereas people who avow a particular gender identity, I mean, maybe not in all cases, but certainly quite commonly, would want it to be accepted that, that gender identity really was their gender identity previously to them making that avowal, right?
Yeah.
So can name make sense of that?
Yeah. So the answer to that is no, not directly. So in the paper, I end with these three different ways you could go. when it comes to referring to your past gender. Because the whole idea of gender as name is to make it much thinner and less substantial than other theories of gender in order to make sense of self-ID. Because if as soon as you put something more substantial on it, as soon as you've got a particular biological feature or a particular social feature, it can suddenly come apart, right?
Yes.
So it kind of has to be thin if we're trying to meet this aim, this ameliorative project aim. So it does have to be thin. So then you've got these, you either stick with the analogy with names and say, like what you just said, your past name was whatever was your name at the time, and if you change it at some point in the future or now, it doesn't change the past, right? That your name was Jim, now it's Bartleby. Same with your gender, right? If you were called back then a man, and you accepted that at the time, and now you're a woman, well, that's just it. You can't change your past. So that would be one way of looking at it. It's just keeping the analogy with names and saying, don't read too much into it. You might want to think of yourself back then as a woman or as a girl, but you weren't, right?
Yeah.
So that would just be one way of just doing it. It's just biting the bullet and saying you can't change the past. If gender's just a name, you've changed your name and that's the way it was. Another way to go, though, is to sort of abandon the analogy as tightly and instead think of it as just having some new rules about the past.
Right.
And so you might think that you can have first-person authority even about your past self and time slices. So either you could say it's a bit like some ways of talking about annulments, where, as we talked about marriage earlier, about how we can bring something about just by saying it, at least in certain circumstances. Maybe you can do a similar thing where you can change the past just by saying it. So perhaps a certain way of thinking about annulment is to say that you have now destroyed the marriage from the past onwards, right? And so maybe that's one way you could think about genders as well, as you, if you choose, you could change your name from this point onwards, or if you want, you can sort of destroy your old gender by saying the words and having some sort of backwards causation. So I go through two different ways in the paper of doing that, but I'm not sure if we should go through those. But yeah, some people have this type of view about other things. So one example is a paper I referenced where they say that Lance Armstrong used to be the winner of the Tour de France, but now isn't. Right. So that only makes sense if you have a view where the past can change, because he did win it, and there was a point at which it was in the past where he did win it, but now he's not the winner.
Yes.
So you've changed the previous fact of him winning. Yes. By some sort of decree. So if you have that sort of, imagine you have a similar sort of decree over your past gender, you can sort of do what you want with it. And it's up to, and you are the relevant authority rather than some sort of body like it is in the sport.
Yes. Okay. So that kind of way of answering that objection that I raised is basically saying, yes, okay, that does show a kind of disanalogy with names, and what we do therefore is say, in most respects, gender is like name, apart from in this respect, that kind of your avowal of your gender identity changes your gender identity not just now, but also in the past. Right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's a relative, I mean, it's, it has some kind of interesting metaphysical consequences, but it's a relatively kind of simple way of tweaking that concept. And if what you're doing is ameliorative, right, you're trying to come up with a way of using gender language or a way of analyzing gender ascriptions, which is going to make things better, then you're kind of free to do that, right? You can do a bit of what we would call conceptual engineering and say, actually, let's use this slightly tweaked version of a name concept.
Yeah, exactly. So really, it's like the target of the paper is for people who are interested and sort of inclusive and want to respect their trans friends, partners, colleagues, and so on, but they're not sure how. Like, they don't want to lie to themselves, right? They want a way to think about gender that is going to allow them to accept someone's first person authority. And so here's one way to think about it that will allow you to do so, and you won't have to sort of lie to yourself, I guess. If you think of gender as a different theory, then there's a possibility that it's going to come apart. And so this way it might help.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. So Graham Bex-Priestley, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.